What's up, everybody? Just want to introduce myself. I don't really do that too often on these videos. You can call me Jay Heat. I'm a sports fanatic, some would say. Some would call me a sports guru. Been into sports all my life, especially basketball, football, and boxing. Three of my favorite sports, and you'll hear me speak about those a lot as time goes on. I just wanted to share a few things. There's been a hot topic going around with the LeBron James versus Michael Jordan talk. It's been a lot of talk of who's the best and can you compare different eras and should you? I do think there is a way to at least somewhat compare. It's never apples to apples, and obviously um, there is some opinion put in there, but there are ways to be at least as objective as possible and speak about the subject. To cut to the chase, in my opinion, when it comes between LeBron James and Michael Jordan, we're really talking about greatness versus who's the best, who plays the game of basketball the best versus who had the most illustrious career, so to speak. And the answer, illustrious career, popularity, would be Michael Jordan. The timing in which he entered the league, the way he blew up, the separation he had in his best days in the 90s from him and the second best player in the league, really elevated his stardom. And he came at a time where everything was really blowing up as far as endorsements and things like that. And he was the face of that. So as popular as LeBron is now, he just isn't Michael Jordan. As far as basketball goes, strictly, and not that Michael by no slouch was a bad basketball player. He was arguably the greatest of all time, skill wise too. But it's very close when you look at him and LeBron. Some people may call it a toss up. If you're being objective, if you say either one is far and above better than the other, you're probably biased. Me personally, I think LeBron James is the better basketball player, but I don't know that he will ever get quite that credit ever in his career, no matter what he does. Really, at this point, even if he were able to, win 3, 4 more championships, people would still revere Mike in a certain way. He had a certain impact on his generation that is going to last for years and years to come. We're not far enough away from it like we was when Mike was doing his thing in the 90s and Bill Russell hadn't done his thing since the 60s. It was a good 30 years. MJ pretty much ended his dominance at the end of the 90s, and it's only been about 20 years. And LeBron, for that matter, even got started, less than 10 years after Michael had already played. So he wasn't completely in the shadow of, say, a Michael Jordan, like, say, Kobe Bryant was. But he definitely had some residual effects because it's a pretty long shadow. But LeBron, when you look at what he does on the court, what he brings to the court, what he's done with less. Michael Jordan had teams where he didn't always have a loaded team with a Scottie Pippen and a Dennis Rodman, all the shooters around him, arguably the greatest coach of all time in Phil Jackson. He had times when he didn't have that. And the league was tough. The Eastern Conference was a little more difficult back then than it would be during LeBron James's time. But the West was not quite as dominant as, say, the West has been during LeBron James's time. So, like, Michael's path to the playoffs, and in the playoffs to get to the championship, was a little more difficult than what LeBron James's was for a long portion of his career. But once LeBron got there to the finals, he had to play some pretty big dogs. Whereas once MJ got to the finals, he had seen sometimes the best he was going to see when he got there. So it's definitely different perspectives. I do think the whole when everybody gets on LeBron about the his killer instinct, his ability to finish when the game's on the line. I think sometimes people get too caught up in the killer instinct aspect of Michael Jordan because um, that's the last truly dominant great style that we saw for about a strong couple decades. But that hasn't always been the case in the league. Just to give you a brief overview, if you don't already know, when the league first was really getting started, or let's move a little forward from not even when it was getting started, but in the first really good decade of the league, which would be considered the 60s. When you had guys dominating like your Oscar Robinsons, who was a all-around player but a big-time scorer, Jerry West, big-time scorer, both of these guys at the guard position. You had Wilt Chamberlain, who was a dominant scorer. Um, and those three, some of the biggest names during those 60s times, Elgin Baylor as well, they didn't win the most rings. Now, there was a guy named Bill Russell, which most of you all probably know, that did dominate the 60s. He won 11 championships in 13 years. Um, and it wasn't just because he had the best players on his team, as some people would tell you. Because before those Celtics got Bill Russell, they weren't winning championships. And when Bill Russell left, it took him a few years to recreate the magic and win again. Russell meant a lot to that franchise. And if you really look at Russell's track record going back to high school, he was a state champion multiple years. His last 2 years, if I'm not mistaken, in high school, he was champion his last 2 years in college. So when he hit the pros and started winning immediately, he was already a winner. Now, Russell learned early in his career, after having a great having a great year, that when he didn't get an MVP award he thought he deserved as the most valuable player in the league, he turned his emphasis. And Russell had to deal with a lot of things back then, also to add on to it. So he had a lot going on, and winning benefited his success and fame, which wasn't always easy to come by, no matter how much they won. But winning did aid him. And he had a certain focus of wanting to win championships at all costs. Even before Michael Jordan, he had a killer instinct, but in a different way he went about doing it. See, to get back to what I was saying about the MVP, he didn't win the MVP, and then decided that if he wasn't going to win the MVP with the numbers he had put up, which he thought at the time were worthy compared to anybody else that had played that year, he just decided, well, if I'm not going to get the MVP, I'm at least going to make sure I win. And he focused more on just winning championships. And in the interest of winning championships, you got to win games. In the interest of winning games, it takes teamwork, working together as a group. He helped teach the group of Celtics how to play as a team. He's one of the best passing big men of all time. A lot of people will tell you he could arguably be the best passing big man of all time. And a lot of people would tell you how he was the greatest defender of all time, and he played defense, but he couldn't score. Yet the man's career average is around 18 a game. So, he had these seasons where he got around 20. He stayed steady. If you look at his seasons, between 17 to 20 points pretty much his entire career. So he could get you buckets, but he had other guys who could help in the effort of scoring. And so he would focus on other things. And it was all team based, whether it was offense, getting the rebound and starting the fast break. The guards knew they could get out on the break and get to an easy layup because of the way Bill saw the floor. Or if it was running the floor when one of the guards got it, because he could run like a gazelle and being the first one down the court. He'd do those things on offense. On defense, he'd make sure when he blocked the ball, to not block it out of bounds, because he saw that as a waste of time, because it ended up sending the ball back to the other team. It was a turnover, essentially, the way he saw it. So he found ways to block the ball and keep it in play, turned the block into a pass, again, to assist the team in winning. And at the time, because he was so dominant, a guy like Wilt Chamberlain, who was a better scorer, Oscar Robertson, Jerry West, the fact that they weren't winning, it was viewed that he was the best player in the 60s by not just random people and fans, but the peers in the league, the NBA. Wilt Chamberlain will even say it if you go and look at some of his old interviews. And so that kind of set the stage in the league for winning championships. You got to be team oriented, and you go through a big man was the thought process. At least that was the way to win, with a big man, point guard that could run the offense like your quarterback in football and play through the big on both ends of the floor. That continued as you went into the 70s. Even though multiple people won the championship, nobody really dominated, but you had teams like the Blazers with a Bill Walton, who played a team game. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, big man, who played an all-around game. He could score, but he was a team-friendly guy as well. And then you get to the 80s, to fast forward. And you have dynasties being formed in the 80s with the Lakers and the Celtics. Bird and Magic were the epitome of team players. They could dominate a game with only taking 15 shots in a game. Didn't have to shoot much to leave their imprint because of the things they could do passing, defensively, rebounding the ball, just their overall IQ. And so it was seen in the 80s, by that point, after having a nice sample size, that being a dominant scorer and your mentality being score first wasn't the way to win a championship. So then basically, as time went on and Michael Jordan hit the league in the mid 80s, he faced a lot of scrutiny. They looked back at guys that I've already mentioned who didn't win, as well as other guys like a George Gervin, who dominated and was a shooting guard, led the league in scoring, but didn't win championships. They used to tell Mike, the media did, and it was a known thing, because he shot a lot. He was a shoot-first guy, didn't necessarily trust his teammates. Credit to him, or I should say, just to not totally bash Michael Jordan, he didn't have the best teammates, but still, in basketball, it's always the best practice to pick your teammates up, try to get the best out of them, from a standpoint of empowering them to be aggressive on the court. And Jordan was so dominant and could get a bucket whenever he wanted, for the most part, that he just had the mentality of taking it over. It was an open court for him, something he wasn't necessarily as used to in college, because he played under a more strict system with Dean Smith. And so he dominated, led the league in scoring. Everybody knows he averaged a 37 his third year, 32, 8, and 8 his second year. He stayed in the 30 plus, but he put up a lot of shots to do it. He did shoot 50% from the field for most of his career, if not his whole career. So even though he was a volume shooter, he was a good shooter because he picked his spots. He didn't just jack up a three or jack up unnecessary shots. He was really good, especially the more his career went on, at finding his sweet spots in the mid-range, off the fadeaway, post-up game, and just slithering his way into the paint to get layups and dunks. He found the easy buckets when he could get them, but was able to hit the tough buckets when he needed to. But his mentality was always shoot first, pass second. And, if he had one guy on him and somebody was open, Mike was shooting it because he felt he had a better chance at it. And because he wasn't winning at first, it was seen as he was like the guys of the past that, were going to dominate, maybe not compared directly to a George Gervin, maybe even more to a Wilt Chamberlain, Maybe he'll get a ring, maybe he won't, but he won't dominate like we know he did. But that changed. He got Phil Jackson. Phil Jackson taught him to trust a little more, to trust the system of the triangle, to trust his teammates to knock down open shots. Still empowered him to be the man. Taught him a level of focus, of how to focus out the crowd and only see the basket. Taught MJ how to be a better individual player, yet also taught him how to be a better teammate as well. And with added help coming in, thanks to the GM, with Phil there to encourage him, and then seeing the fruits of his labor as they won when he did trust his teammates, Michael became the total complete great player that we know, and most people feel is the greatest of all time. And he proved the critics wrong in doing so, because he was a shooting guard who led the league in scoring multiple times, and was able to win that way, being the shoot first guy, but learning how to pass a little more than he was the first half of his career, learning to make the critical pass in the critical moment and trust the guy to knock down the shot, but still being that guy who was trusted to carry the load and willing to carry the load and take the shots. Certain guys wouldn't have been able to play with MJ because of his mentality. He wasn't the type of guy that could play with anybody like a Magic Johnson or Larry Bird. But if you put the right pieces around him, like his GM Jerry Krause did, they dominated the league. So when that happened, I think that changed people's minds a little bit, and it continued. What kind of helped that mentality continue, and I think really put that in fans' minds, has been the fact that Kobe coming after Mike, he embodied everything that Mike represented. And he brought that same killer instinct. Even when playing with Shaq, when the game was on the line in the fourth quarter, Kobe was taking the shot, doing all the same stuff. Kobe had to learn too. Once Shaq left, he had some years where he thought he was just going to turn it up another notch and get it done, even with the guys that was on his team. And he did kill, averaging 35 a game in the mid 2000s, putting up the 81 we know about, the 60 and 3/4 game-winning shots, but he was losing. He got sent home, almost quit against Phoenix in a series. And, that wasn't quite working. He got some teammates around him to help in the late 2000s, and he started trusting his teammates a little more and just doing some of the little things, whatever it took to win games. And the story, I guess the moral of the story is, regardless of anything, you got to be a balanced basketball player to be one of the greats. If you're all score or all pass, you're probably not going to turn into one of the greats, because usually all the greats have been able to do just about a little bit of everything. And so for Kobe and Michael to find a way to get back a little bit of balance from the scoring to being a little more of a passer too, even though they still lean towards the scoring, they were able to be the champions that they were. But it set a certain mindset. They were the most popular two from 90s through the 2000s until LeBron James hit the scene, which is where we started and where I am still getting back to. But LeBron James, when he hit the scene, everybody that mainly was watching, except for people old enough to remember the 70s and 60s and 80s, they pretty much, what was most recently on their mind was the killer that was Michael Jordan, the killer that has been Kobe Bryant. Let's not forget Allen Iverson, Tracy McGrady, all from about that same type of, all from that same tree as far as the way they approach the game. And so when LeBron came, LeBron actually brought a little more of an older school vibe with his game. It was more like a Magic or a Bird or a Russell, in the way he was team first oriented right when he hit, from the jump, when he hit the league. He was that way in high school, jumped 2 levels and brought that same type of game to the league. And so he was seen as a guy at that point, because I think we had lost touch a little bit with, the way championships have been built for most of the league's history. We got into looking for that next Mike. People wanted it to be Kobe. Kobe was close, but he wasn't quite Mike. So then this guy comes along who's bigger, stronger, faster than Mike, and I think we wanted him too much to be just like Mike. But he was just trying to be LeBron James. You look at an old clip of Michael Jordan, he has an interview where he's young and they asked him, did he want to be, I think Dr. J it was, or the next Dr. J, and he said he thought the name Michael Jordan was just fine. Bron, he never had an interview quite like that I remember, but that's basically the way he approached it, even with a Kobe and a Michael Jordan who had been before him and who he was old enough to had seen either them play directly or a lot of clips of them playing. He still approached the game with the whole history in his mind and knowing how to win as a team right from the get-go. So sometimes LeBron gets crushed for that because he makes the right play and people will roll their eyes like a Skip Bayless or other commentator or other sports broadcasters, that will talk about him. But he really does make the right play and he's not afraid to take the game winner. If you look at a lot of his big games, he's had some big time game winners. I believe it's a stat that he's hit more game winners in the playoffs than Mike. We just don't notice it as much. Now he has lost in the finals, and let's go there. He lost 6 times in the finals. MJ, he only lost. He didn't lose at all. I'm sorry, but he only lost in the playoffs before he got to the finals. LeBron's never lost in the first round. So whenever he gets there, he's getting through the first round. MJ been swept in the first round on multiple occasions, if I'm not mistaken. But let's just go with the finals directly. You look at the 6 teams Mike played or the 6 championships he played in and the 5 teams he played against. While they were all great, it's really hard, if you really think about it, to think that any of them were the equivalent of the Golden State Warriors that LeBron was playing. When you look at the firepower and star power, I mean, you could argue the Warriors, when they had Kevin Durant, were a better team than the Bulls or the Showtime Lakers. And that's saying something. And LeBron, it wasn't like he was helpless. He had 2 All-Stars with him, 2 top picks, another number 1 pick in Kyrie Irving like him, big-time guy in Kevin Love, who at one point was considered the best in his position in the league. He had guys. He had a good coach with championship experience as a player and, a good pedigree. But the team was just better and they beat him. But they were so good. They were such a good team. When you think about it, Mike never played anybody like that. And LBJ played him twice and once without a Kyrie Irving to help him. And then he played him without Kyrie or Kevin Love one year. Now, Kevin Durant wasn't there, but if you take Kyrie and Kevin off of Bron's team, the Warriors still a huge advantage there. And then there was 3 times, he had to play the Spurs, which were a dynasty of their own. So 2 teams that you would look at as dynastic and how dominant they were. LeBron had to play them 7 of the 9 times he went to the finals. MJ, the only somewhat of a dynasty he had to deal with was getting through the Lakers in the first in the first championship that he played in. After that, everybody else, none of them ever won championships, even when they weren't playing against Michael Jordan. The Blazers lost to Detroit. Phoenix, I only think got there the one time in 93. And, Seattle sometimes got bounced in the first round before they got to the finals. But they, Mike took care of them. And Utah got there twice, was a legitimate, pretty decent squad that you may think, if not for Michael Jordan, would have had at least 1 championship in the 90s. But still no Golden State, definitely no Golden State with KD. But I wouldn't even say as good as the Golden State team that lost to LeBron in 2016. And then also not as good as the Spurs, 2007, 2013, 2014. So LeBron's played some dogs. So when people say, all the guys MJ went up against in the 80s and 90s, especially the 80s with the Pistons and, the Lakers and the Celtics being in that time. And in the 90s, having to go battle with the Knicks constantly, and having to beat a Utah 2 years in a row. It's not that he didn't have wars he played in, but we undersell the wars LeBron's been in. They're both great players. What I'll say, to give both of them some credit, when we saw Mike with the help he needed, an all-star in Scottie Pippen, another all-star caliber player in Dennis Rodman, the greatest coach of all time, Mike was unbeatable. Now, he didn't play against the quality, or at least not quite the quality of talent LBJ played against, but nevertheless, he was unbeatable, didn't go to a game 7. LBJ got his help with Wade and Bosh, and then, in my opinion, you could even argue he upgraded in a sense with Kyrie and Love, because Love was a little younger than Bosh. Again, at one point was considered the best in his position. Bosh was never that, even though he was a perennial all-star. Kyrie, although Wade in his peak was better than Kyrie, the Wade that LeBron played with, especially the last couple years in Miami, wasn't as good as the young Kyrie he got, the stud he got in Kyrie, who was, blossoming into his greatness as LeBron got there. So, I mean, he had an 8-year run of playing with dominant teams that maybe MJ wouldn't have lost with those guys. Who knows? It's hard to say, because of the competition he would have still had to play against, like LeBron did. But he didn't lose. But then we look at MJ when he didn't have those guys, and like I said, he got swept multiple times in the playoffs, in the first round. Whereas LBJ took teams to the finals. The 2007 Cavs team is one of the most remarkable finals runs you'll ever see. The guy put him on his back, and LeBron's the type of guy that does everything out there. So he's not as good a scorer as Mike. He's not as good of a defender as Mike when it comes to guarding on the ball in the 1 or 2 position spots. But if you're talking 3, 4, 5, LeBron's got him. If you're talking about just the ability to be versatile and can guard a 1 if you get switched on 1, and a center if you get switched on them, LeBron got that too. So defense-wise, they're close to even when you look at the totality of what they bring to the floor on defense when they were in their prime. But Mike does have the Defensive Player of the Year award. Who knows if he'd have won one during this era or not. But he won one in his era. LeBron has been first team all defense and in the conversation for Defensive Player of the Year. But LeBron, his ability to pass, his IQ, is probably unmatched by anybody other than a Bill Russell from the 60s, or maybe a Magic Johnson in the 80s. That's about it. That's the list. And his ability to rebound along with pass makes up for him not quite being as good of a scorer as Michael Jordan. It makes it a little more even. And we have to remember he's a couple inches taller, 50, 60 pounds heavier. This stuff matters. If he was playing during that time in the 80s, he'd be dominant too. Not to say Mike wouldn't do his thing now. But just don't brush it aside or think that either guy is head and shoulders above the other. Don't get caught up in the nostalgia of Mike. And, the commercials were lovely if you're somebody who's my age, which I'm approaching 40 soon. If you're my age or older, you remember that I wanna be like Mike. You remember that. You feel that. You remember watching it. You remember Space Jam and all that, and I get it. But if you look real closely and be non-objective about it, LBJ's right there, and if either one you pick, you ain't going wrong. Me personally, LeBron James seems like the more complete package. But again, it's a tough call. You be the judge. Let me know what you think. This was a very long video. Hopefully the information kept you in, and kept you wanting to listen. I'll be with some more shorter stuff next time. And sometimes I might have a lot to get off my chest, but this J Heat Sports Guru. My handle on Twitter is The Vault, at The Vault, JMU414. I am definitely there talking about sports as well. Catch me on Instagram as well. But definitely support on YouTube if you can. And hopefully everybody's being safe out there during this corona thing. All right. Holla at you later. J Heat Sports Guru.